The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty airfield as Captain Margaret Maggie Sullivan checked her aircraft for the third time. Her hands moved with practiced precision over every bolt, wire, and surface of the small reconnaissance plane. Most people at the base had never seen her do this routine. Most people at the base had never seen her at all. For 18 months, Maggie had been the military's best-kept secret. While male pilots received medals and newspaper coverage, she flew the most dangerous missions over enemy territory. Her commanding officers kept her achievements buried in classified files, her existence known only to a handful of senior staff. The official story was simple. Women weren't suited for combat aviation. The unofficial reality was more complicated. Maggie possessed something no other pilot in a European theater could claim. She had memorized every mountain peak, valley, and landmark across the treacherous Alpine route into occupied Austria. During her civilian flying days before the war, she had spent countless hours navigating those deadly passes, delivering medical supplies to remote villages. When the war began, that knowledge became invaluable, but her gender made it unusable according to military policy. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, had made his position clear from day one. "Sullivan, you're here because Washington ordered it, not because I want you here. You'll fly when we need you, but don't expect any fanfare. The men don't need to see a woman doing their job." So Maggie flew in darkness, landed before dawn, and submitted her reports through back channels. She mapped enemy positions, photographed strategic targets, and gathered intelligence that saved hundreds of Allied lives. Her fellow pilots knew someone was getting incredible reconnaissance data, but they assumed it came from their own ranks or from resistance fighters on the ground. The secrecy ate at her sometimes. During mess hall dinners, she listened to pilots discuss missions she had actually flown, crediting unknown heroes or lucky breaks for intelligence she had risked her life to gather. But Maggie understood the bigger picture. The war effort mattered more than personal recognition. Her mechanic, Sergeant Bobby Chun, was one of the few people who knew the truth. He maintained her aircraft and kept her flying schedule confidential. "You're the best pilot on this base," he told her regularly. These other guys couldn't navigate a straight road in good weather, let alone mountain passes in a storm. Bobby had immigrated from China before the war and faced his own struggles with acceptance in the military. He understood what it meant to prove yourself constantly while others questioned your right to serve. Together, they formed an efficient team that operated in shadows. The Austrian route had claimed 12 Allied aircraft in the past 6 months. The mountain passes were narrow, unpredictable, and heavily defended. German fighters patrolled the area constantly, and anti-aircraft guns were positioned at strategic points throughout the valleys. Weather conditions changed without warning, turning clear skies into deadly storms within minutes. 3 different pilot teams had attempted to establish regular reconnaissance flights over the route. All had failed, with most crews either shot down or forced to turn back due to impossible navigation challenges. The military desperately needed current intelligence about German troop movements and supply lines through Austria, but the mission seemed impossible. Maggie knew she could complete those flights successfully. She had navigated the same mountains in winter storms, mechanical failures, and limited visibility during her civilian days. Her small aircraft was perfect for the mission, and her knowledge of the terrain gave her advantages no other pilot possessed. But suggesting herself for the mission was impossible under current circumstances. Instead, she waited and continued her secret flights over other territories. Each night brought new intelligence-gathering missions, and each morning brought the same routine of hidden landings and classified reports. She watched other pilots struggle with navigation challenges she could solve easily, knowing her expertise was being wasted while soldiers died for lack of accurate intelligence. The war was changing rapidly in late 1944. Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts, but success required precise coordination and current intelligence about enemy positions. The Austrian route represented a critical gap in Allied knowledge, one that could determine the success or failure of upcoming offensive operations. General Patricia Hayes, one of the few female officers in senior command positions, had been reviewing intelligence reports about the Austrian situation. She noticed discrepancies between official mission reports and the quality of reconnaissance data being gathered elsewhere in the theater. Someone was producing exceptional intelligence work, but the identity of that source remained unclear in official records. Hayes began investigating quietly, reviewing personnel files and mission reports with fresh eyes. Her military career had been built on asking difficult questions and finding solutions others missed. The Austrian route problem represented exactly the kind of challenge that required unconventional thinking. Meanwhile, Maggie continued her hidden operations, unaware that her work was attracting attention from unexpected quarters. She flew her missions, maintained her cover, and waited for circumstances to change. The morning routine of checking her aircraft had become meditation, a quiet moment before facing another day of invisible service to her country. The war would soon demand everything from everyone, and Maggie's moment of recognition was approaching faster than anyone realized. Her expertise would become impossible to ignore when the alternative was accepting defeat in a critical theater of operations. But, for now, she remained hidden, known only to a few trusted allies who understood her true value to the war effort. The telegram arrived on a cold December morning that changed everything. General Patricia Hayes stood in the communications tent, reading the urgent message from Supreme Allied Command. Operation Mountain Eagle was approved, and execution would begin within 72 hours. The mission required immediate and accurate reconnaissance of German positions along the Austrian Alpine route, information that could determine the success of the largest Allied offensive since D-Day. Hayes folded the telegram and walked directly to Colonel Harrison's office. She had spent weeks researching the Austrian route problem and the pilots who had failed to solve it. Her investigation had led to some interesting discoveries about mission reports and personnel records that didn't align with official stories. "Colonel, we need to discuss the Austrian reconnaissance immediately," Hayes announced as she entered Harrison's office without knocking. Her rank and reputation gave her privileges that few officers enjoyed, and she used them when necessary. Harrison looked up nervously from his desk. He knew Hayes by reputation as someone who asked uncomfortable questions and demanded honest answers. "General, I've already explained that we don't have pilots capable of navigating those mountain passes successfully. We've lost too many good men attempting those flights." "That's interesting," Hayes replied, settling into a chair across from his desk. "Because I've been reviewing intelligence reports from this base, and someone here has been producing exceptional reconnaissance data from extremely challenging territories. The navigation skills demonstrated in these reports suggest we do have someone capable of handling difficult mountain flying." The color drained from Harrison's face. He had hoped the classified nature of Maggie's missions would keep them buried in paperwork forever. "General, I'm not sure what reports you're referring to. Our standard reconnaissance operations follow approved protocols." Hayes pulled a thick folder from her briefcase and placed it on Harrison's desk. "These reports detail navigation through terrain that your official pilot roster claims is impossible to fly. Either you have pilots whose capabilities aren't reflected in their files, or someone is flying missions that don't appear in your standard operational reports." Harrison knew he was cornered. The intelligence Maggie had gathered was too distinctive to deny, and Hayes clearly understood aviation well enough to recognize exceptional piloting skills. "General, the situation is complicated." "Uncomplicated," Hayes ordered. "Supreme Allied Command needs the Austrian route mapped within 72 hours, or Operation Mountain Eagle fails before it begins." "I don't care about complications. I care about results." After 20 minutes of careful questioning, Hayes extracted the truth about Captain Margaret Sullivan. She learned about the hidden flights, the classified reports, and the policy of keeping female pilots out of public recognition. Harrison tried to justify the secrecy by citing military regulations and concerns about unit morale. "Colonel, You've been hiding the one pilot who can complete this mission while letting others die attempting it, Hayes said coldly. Bring Captain Sullivan to me immediately. Maggie was summoned from the airfield where she had been performing maintenance on her aircraft. She entered the colonel's office expecting another routine briefing about classified operations. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with General Hayes, whose reputation for direct communication preceded her throughout the military. Captain Sullivan, I understand you have extensive experience flying the Austrian mountain passes. Hayes began without preamble. I need to know exactly what you can accomplish in that terrain under current conditions. Maggie glanced at Colonel Harrison, who nodded reluctantly. She had never spoken directly to a general about her capabilities, and the opportunity to be honest about her skills felt liberating. General, I can navigate every pass in the Austrian Alps in any weather conditions short of a complete whiteout. I've flown those routes hundreds of times and know every landmark, updraft, and danger point. Hayes leaned forward with interest. The military has lost 12 aircraft attempting to establish reconnaissance over that route. What makes you confident you can succeed where others have failed? Ma'am, those pilots were flying blind through terrain I know better than the roads around my hometown. They're trying to navigate using maps and instruments through passes that require visual recognition of specific rock formations and wind patterns. I spent 3 years flying medical supply runs through those mountains before the war. I could fly most of that route with my eyes closed. The conviction in Maggie's voice impressed Hayes. She had interviewed dozens of pilots about challenging missions, and few showed the quiet confidence that came from genuine expertise. Captain, Operation Mountain Eagle depends on current intelligence about German positions along the Alpine route. Can you provide that intelligence? Yes, ma'am. Give me access to appropriate aircraft and mission parameters, and I'll get you detailed reconnaissance of the entire route within 24 hours. Harrison interrupted nervously. General, regulations clearly state that women are not authorized for combat reconnaissance missions. Captain Sullivan has been flying classified operations under special circumstances, but a mission of this magnitude would require official approval from the highest levels. Hayes stood and fixed Harrison with a stare that had intimidated colonels across 2 continents. Colonel, Supreme Allied Command has given me full authority to utilize any resources necessary for Operation Mountain Eagle. Captain Sullivan is now officially assigned to this mission under my direct command. She turned to Maggie with a slight smile. Captain, you've been flying in shadows long enough. Tomorrow morning, you'll brief my staff on Austrian route navigation, and tomorrow afternoon, you'll fly the most important reconnaissance mission of this war. The entire operation depends on the intelligence you gather. Maggie felt a mix of excitement and relief. After 18 months of hidden service, she would finally use her expertise on a mission that mattered. General, I won't let you down. Those mountain passes don't hold any secrets from me. Hayes gathered her papers and prepared to leave. Colonel Harrison, you'll provide Captain Sullivan with whatever support she requires. Any delays or complications will be reported directly to Supreme Allied Command with your name attached. As Hayes left the office, Harrison slumped in his chair. The secret he had worked so hard to maintain was now exposed at the highest levels of command. Maggie remained standing, processing the sudden change in her circumstances. Captain, Harrison said wearily, it appears your flying days in the shadows are over. General Hayes doesn't make requests. She gives orders, and people follow them or find new careers. Maggie nodded and headed for the door. She had work to do, planning for a mission that would finally allow her to serve her country without hiding her capabilities. The Austrian mountains were waiting, and this time she would fly them under official orders from the highest levels of Allied command. The war was about to discover what she had always known. Some routes could only be flown by someone who truly knew the way. The briefing room fell silent as Maggie entered. 20 officers, including several generals and intelligence specialists, turned to study the woman who claimed she could navigate the deadly Austrian passes where so many others had failed. Some faces showed skepticism, others curiosity, but all reflected the desperate hope of military leaders who needed miracles to win wars. General Hayes stood at the front of the room beside a large map of the Austrian Alps. Red X marks indicated where Allied aircraft had been lost attempting reconnaissance flights. The marks covered the map like a deadly rash, testimony to the route's lethal reputation. Gentlemen, Captain Margaret Sullivan will brief us on navigation procedures for the Austrian Alpine route, Hayes announced. Pay attention. Her knowledge may determine whether Operation Mountain Eagle succeeds or fails. Maggie walked to the map with steady confidence. She had imagined this moment during countless hidden flights, wondering what it would feel like to share her expertise openly. Now, facing the skeptical stares of senior officers, she felt the weight of proving herself to men who had never considered her capable of such knowledge. The primary error in previous reconnaissance attempts has been treating these mountains like normal terrain, she began, pointing to the first mountain pass. These aren't just geographical features. They're weather systems, wind tunnels, and navigation puzzles that change by the hour. She traced a route across the map with her finger, avoiding the areas marked with red X symbols. Previous missions followed direct flight paths based on standard military navigation. That approach is suicide in these mountains. The only successful route requires following specific valleys that create updrafts, using landmark navigation instead of instruments, and timing flights to avoid predictable weather patterns. Colonel Matthews, an experienced bomber pilot, interrupted with obvious doubt. Captain, those passes are barely wide enough for single-engine aircraft. How can you navigate them accurately while avoiding enemy fire and maintaining reconnaissance objectives? Maggie smiled slightly. Sir, I've flown medical supply missions through those passes during winter storms when visibility was less than 50 feet. The secret is knowing which rock formations indicate safe flying zones and which ones warn of dangerous downdrafts or German gun positions. She moved to another section of the map, pointing to specific peaks. This summit here looks identical to 3 others in the area, but it's the only one with a distinctive shadow pattern in afternoon light. Navigation through the next pass depends on recognizing that shadow. Miss it, and you'll fly directly into a box canyon where the Germans have anti-aircraft guns positioned for exactly that mistake. The room's atmosphere shifted as Maggie demonstrated detailed knowledge that clearly surpassed anything in their standard intelligence files. She described wind patterns, seasonal weather changes, and landmark recognition techniques that could only come from extensive personal experience. The German positions aren't random, she continued, moving to another map section. They've placed their defenses based on standard flight approaches that any military pilot would attempt. But there's an alternate route through the northern passes that avoids every major defensive position while providing excellent reconnaissance opportunities. General Hayes watched the faces of her staff officers as they absorbed Maggie's briefing. Skepticism was changing to interest, then to excitement as they realized they might actually have found a solution to their impossible problem. Captain, can you provide detailed reconnaissance of German troop movements, supply lines, and defensive positions along this route? Asked Colonel Burke, the Operations Intelligence Coordinator. Yes, sir. My aircraft can photograph the entire route while remaining below radar detection and beyond range of most anti-aircraft weapons. The mountain terrain provides natural cover that makes interception nearly impossible if you know how to use it properly. She outlined a specific flight plan that would gather intelligence critical to Operation Mountain Eagle. The plan involved multiple passes through different valleys, each designed to photograph specific targets while avoiding known defensive positions. The route she proposed would take 6 hours to complete, but would provide comprehensive intelligence about German capabilities along the entire Alpine corridor. The key to success is flying like you belong in those mountains, not like you're trying to conquer them, Maggie explained. Every pilot we've lost was fighting the terrain instead of working with it. The mountains will kill you if you don't respect them, but they'll hide you from enemies if you understand their patterns. Colonel Harrison, who had been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke. Captain Sullivan, these are claims that sound impressive, but lives depend on accurate intelligence. Can you guarantee success on this mission? Maggie faced Harrison directly. Colonel, I can't guarantee that German fighters won't shoot me down or that mechanical failure won't force an emergency landing. But I can guarantee that if weather conditions allow any aircraft to navigate those passes successfully, mine will be that aircraft. General Hayes stepped forward. Captain, Operation Mountain Eagle begins in 36 hours. The entire offensive depends on the intelligence you gather. Are you prepared to fly this mission tomorrow? Yes, ma'am. I've been preparing for this mission for 18 months without knowing it. Every classified flight I've completed has been training for exactly this type of operation. The briefing continued for another hour as Maggie answered detailed questions about altitude requirements, communication procedures, and emergency protocols. Her responses demonstrated not only knowledge of the terrain, but understanding of military intelligence requirements and operational security. As the meeting concluded, several officers approached Maggie privately to express amazement at her expertise. Some admitted they had never expected to encounter such detailed mountain flying knowledge from any pilot, male or female. The mission that had seemed impossible was beginning to look achievable. General Hayes was the last to speak with Maggie. Captain, tomorrow you'll have the attention of Supreme Allied Command. This mission could change the course of the European campaign. Are you ready for that responsibility? General, I've been ready for this responsibility since the first time I flew those mountains, Maggie replied. The only difference now is that my service won't be hidden anymore. Hayes nodded approvingly. Get some rest, Captain. Tomorrow you'll prove that the best pilot for this mission was here all along, waiting for someone to recognize what you could accomplish. As Maggie left the briefing room, she felt the weight and excitement of finally using her abilities without restriction. The Austrian mountains were waiting, and this time she would fly them as an officially recognized pilot on a mission that could help win the war. Tomorrow would change everything, not just for the operation, but for every female pilot who had been told she wasn't capable of serving her country in combat roles. The mountains that had claimed so many aircraft would finally meet someone who knew their secrets. Dawn broke gray and cold over the airfield as Maggie completed her final aircraft inspection. Ice crystals formed on the metal surfaces, and her breath created small clouds in the frigid air. Weather conditions were marginal, but acceptable for the most important mission of her career. In 3 hours, Allied forces would begin moving based on the intelligence she was about to gather. Sergeant Bobby Chun worked alongside her, checking every system twice. Engines running perfect, navigation equipment calibrated, camera mounts secure, he reported. This bird's never been in better condition. Thanks, Bobby. You've kept her flying through everything else. One more mission won't hurt her. General Hayes arrived at the flight line accompanied by Colonel Burke and a communications specialist. She carried sealed orders and a direct radio frequency that would connect Maggie to Supreme Allied Command headquarters during the mission. Captain, weather reports indicate clear conditions over the target area for the next 4 hours, Hayes briefed. After that, a winter storm system moves in that would make return flights impossible until tomorrow. You have a narrow window to complete this reconnaissance and returned safely. Maggie nodded, studying the meteorological data. The storm timing actually worked in her favor. German fighter patrols would be grounded during the weather front, reducing the chance of interception. General, the storm conditions will provide cover for my return flight. If I time the mission correctly, I'll be flying home in weather that keeps enemy aircraft on the ground. Captain, Supreme Allied Command wants you to know that your mission today carries the highest priority classification. The photographs and intelligence you gather will be transmitted directly to General Eisenhower's staff for immediate analysis. The weight of that responsibility settled on Maggie's shoulders. 3 years of hidden service had led to this moment when her expertise would directly influence major strategic decisions. Ma'am, I understand the importance of this mission. I won't disappoint you. Hayes handed Maggie the sealed orders and radio codes. Captain, there's one more thing you should know. Word of today's mission has reached the highest levels of Allied command. There are important people watching to see what you accomplish. Maggie climbed into her aircraft and began the engine start sequence. The familiar vibration and sound of her plane preparing for flight calmed her nerves and focused her mind on the challenges ahead. This was just another mission through mountain terrain she knew better than any pilot alive. The takeoff was smooth, and the initial flight path took her toward the Austrian border through airspace she had navigated many times before. As the mountains appeared on the horizon, Maggie felt the confidence that came from absolute familiarity with the terrain ahead. The first challenge came at the border crossing where German radar stations monitored Allied aircraft movements. Maggie descended to an altitude that put her below radar coverage while following a valley route that avoided known defensive positions. Her knowledge of the terrain allowed navigation that appeared reckless, but was actually calculated to avoid detection. The Austrian Alps rose around her like cathedral spires, magnificent and deadly. Snow-covered peaks stretched in every direction, and the narrow passes between them created wind patterns that could destroy aircraft in seconds. But Maggie read the mountain signs like a familiar language, adjusting her flight path to use favorable winds while avoiding the downdrafts that had claimed previous reconnaissance flights. The first reconnaissance target appeared ahead, a major German supply depot hidden in a valley that previous missions had failed to locate. Maggie descended to photography altitude and began the camera runs that would provide Allied intelligence with detailed information about enemy supply operations. German anti-aircraft fire erupted around her position as enemy gunners detected the aircraft. But Maggie was already adjusting course based on her knowledge of escape routes through the mountains. She climbed into a narrow pass that enemy guns couldn't target while maintaining the flight path needed for complete photographic coverage. The second target was more challenging, a German airfield constructed in a mountain valley where enemy fighters could launch interception attacks against Allied bombing runs. The location had been suspected, but never confirmed due to the deadly terrain surrounding it. Maggie approached the airfield through a route that used mountain ridges to mask her aircraft until the final moment. The photography run required flying directly over heavily defended positions, but her knowledge of mountain wind patterns allowed her to complete the mission at speeds and altitudes that made accurate anti-aircraft fire nearly impossible. Enemy fighters appeared on the horizon as she finished photographing the airfield, but Maggie was already entering a mountain pass too narrow for the larger German aircraft to follow. The enemy pilots were forced to watch helplessly as she disappeared into terrain they couldn't safely navigate. The final reconnaissance target was the most important, a mountain pass where German troops were positioning for a counterattack against Allied advances. Intelligence about enemy troop strength and defensive preparations would determine whether Operation Mountain Eagle could proceed as planned. The approach to this target required flying through the most dangerous terrain of the mission. German defensive positions were concentrated in the area, and the mountain passes offered limited escape routes. But Maggie's knowledge of seasonal wind patterns allowed her to approach from an unexpected direction that avoided most enemy defenses. The photography run over German troop positions revealed information that exceeded Allied expectations. Enemy forces were larger than estimated and positioned for operations that could threaten multiple Allied objectives. The intelligence Maggie gathered would require immediate transmission to Allied command for strategic reassessment. As she completed the final reconnaissance target, the approaching weather front began affecting flying conditions. Snow clouds gathered around mountain peaks, and wind patterns shifted in ways that would challenge even experienced mountain pilots. But these were exactly the conditions Maggie had trained for during her civilian flying days. The return flight through deteriorating weather required every skill she possessed. Visibility decreased as snow began falling, and wind shears created turbulence that tested her aircraft's structural limits. But Maggie navigated by landmark recognition and instinct developed through years of mountain flying experience. She emerged from the mountain passes as the storm closed behind her, cutting off any possibility of German pursuit. The weather that made her return flight difficult provided complete protection from enemy aircraft unable to operate in such conditions. The landing at her home base was smooth despite crosswinds that would have challenged most pilots. General Hayes and her staff were waiting as Maggie taxied to the flight line, eager to receive intelligence that would shape Allied operations for weeks to come. As she shut down the engine, Maggie realized that everything had changed. She was no longer the hidden pilot whose abilities were kept secret. She was now the aviator who had accomplished what others couldn't, flying a mission that proved her expertise beyond any doubt. The intelligence photographs spread across the table in General Hayes' command center revealed more than anyone had expected. German troop concentrations were 3 times larger than Allied estimates, and enemy defensive positions threatened multiple aspects of Operation Mountain Eagle. Maggie's reconnaissance had potentially saved thousands of Allied lives by exposing the true scope of German preparations. Captain Sullivan, this intelligence is remarkable, Colonel Burke announced as he studied the detailed photographs. The clarity and coverage of these images exceeds anything we've obtained from previous reconnaissance attempts. You've provided information that changes our entire understanding of German capabilities in this region. General Hayes examined the photographs with satisfaction and concern. The mission had been a complete success, but the intelligence gathered required immediate strategic adjustments to Allied planning. Captain, these images show German positions that could have destroyed our advanced forces if we hadn't discovered them beforehand. Supreme Allied Command responded to the intelligence within hours. General Eisenhower's headquarters transmitted new operational orders based on Maggie's reconnaissance, redirecting Allied forces and adjusting tactical approaches to account for the larger German presence. Operation Mountain Eagle would proceed, but with modifications that reflected the true enemy situation. The success of Maggie's mission created immediate changes in military policy regarding female pilots. General Hayes received authorization to assign women to combat reconnaissance roles where their specific expertise justified such assignments. The Austrian route mission had demonstrated that pilot capability mattered more than military tradition. Within days, Maggie found herself briefing other female pilots who had been serving in support roles despite possessing advanced flying skills. The military was beginning to recognize that winning the war required utilizing all available talent, regardless of gender restrictions that had limited effectiveness. The key to survival in combat reconnaissance is knowing your aircraft and terrain better than anyone else, Maggie explained to her new squadron of female pilots. We've been proving ourselves in shadow roles for months. Now we get to prove ourselves where it counts most. Colonel Harrison, who had opposed Maggie's official recognition for so long, was reassigned to administrative duties away from flight operations. General Hayes made it clear that officers who wasted valuable pilot expertise due to personal prejudices had no place in combat commands. The war was changing rapidly as 1945 approached. Allied forces were advancing on multiple fronts, but success required the kind of precise intelligence that Maggie's mission had provided. The Austrian route became a regular reconnaissance objective, with Maggie leading missions that kept Allied commanders informed about German troop movements and supply operations. Newspaper reporters eventually learned about the female pilot who had solved the Austrian reconnaissance problem. Stories appeared in American newspapers describing the hidden aviator whose expertise had been discovered just when it was needed most. Maggie became a symbol of competent service regardless of gender restrictions. Letters arrived from women across America who had been told they couldn't serve their country in meaningful roles. Maggie's success proved that expertise and dedication mattered more than traditional limitations on what women could accomplish. Her example encouraged others to pursue opportunities in aviation and other fields previously restricted to men. The recognition was gratifying, but Maggie remained focused on her military duties. The war was far from over, and every mission she flew gathered intelligence that saved Allied lives and advanced the cause of victory. Personal recognition mattered less than successful completion of her responsibilities. Sergeant Bobby Chun was promoted to flight line supervisor, responsible for maintaining aircraft used by the expanding female pilot program. His partnership with Maggie had demonstrated that effective military service came from competence and dedication rather than conformity to traditional expectations. "You've changed everything," he told Maggie during a routine maintenance inspection. 6 months ago, female pilots were invisible. Now, they're leading some of our most important missions. The Austrian reconnaissance program expanded as Allied forces advanced toward Germany. Maggie trained other pilots in mountain navigation techniques, passing on knowledge that would have been lost if her expertise had remained hidden. Her experience became the foundation for improved pilot training that saved lives and increased mission success rates. General Hayes was promoted to oversee pilot training programs throughout the European theater. Her recognition of Maggie's abilities had demonstrated leadership that identified and utilized talent wherever existed. The Austrian mission became a case study in effective personnel management that influenced military policies for years to come. By spring 1945, the female pilots trained by Maggie were flying reconnaissance missions across multiple theaters of operation. What had begun as a desperate solution to one impossible mission had evolved into a systematic utilization of previously wasted expertise. The military was stronger because it had learned to value capability over tradition. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but the lessons learned from Maggie's story continued to influence military aviation. The pilot who had been kept hidden for 18 months had proven that expertise and dedication transcended artificial limitations. Her success opened opportunities for generations of female aviators who followed. Years after the war, Maggie continued flying as a commercial pilot, applying her mountain navigation expertise to civilian aviation challenges. She became an instructor pilot, teaching the same terrain reading skills that had made her invaluable during wartime reconnaissance missions. The Austrian Alps never lost their danger, but they no longer held secrets from pilots trained in Maggie's navigation techniques. What had once been impossible terrain became manageable through knowledge and experience. The mountains that had claimed so many aircraft learned to respect those who understood their patterns. Maggie's story became part of aviation history, taught to pilot trainees as an example of how expertise could emerge from unexpected sources. The hidden aviator who had been discovered when her country needed her most had changed military aviation forever, proving that talent and dedication could overcome any artificial barrier to service. The general who had demanded the only aviator who knew the route had found exactly what the war required, someone whose knowledge could turn impossible missions into successful operations. Sometimes the best solution to a problem was the person who had been waiting in the shadows for someone to recognize their true capabilities.